Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, and welcome to this week's History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and we're streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube, and you can watch these videos on either of those platforms anytime afterward. If you've not already done so, please silence your cell phone. This is Home. Medgar Evers, Mississippi and the Movement opens upstairs on Thursday, June 1st. The exhibit marks the 60th anniversary of the assassination of Medgar Evers and covers his early life and family, his career with the NAACP, and his lasting legacy. The exhibit will close on June 30, so I hope that you'll take a look at that while it's open. And I hope that you'll come back next week for History's Lunch when Carolyn J. Brown and Carla Wall will discuss the life of Thalia Mara. Of course, Thalia Mara was instrumental in bringing the International Ballet Competition to Jackson, and this year it starts on June 10th. Today, we're delighted to welcome back M.J. O'Brien to present the 60th anniversary of the Jackson Woolworth sit-in. As we had discussed before, on the evening of February 21st of 2013, I guess, O'Brien spoke at the Old Capitol Museum. The weather was frightful. Rain was accompanied by building rattling thunder and flashes of lightning, and it kept the folks away. And we are delighted to have this opportunity to have him back to talk about the excellent University Press of Mississippi book that he wrote on the Woolworth's sit-in. M.J. O'Brien earned a B.A. in philosophy from St. Mary's Seminary College in Baltimore and a B.A. in journalism from the American University in Washington, D.C. He retired after a 30-year career as a communications professional and wrote his book, We Shall Not Be Moved, The Jackson Woolworth's Sit-In and the Movement It Inspired, which was published by University Press of Mississippi and won the 2014 Lillian Smith Book Award. O'Brien is at work on a book for University Press now about the Tougaloo Nine. Help me welcome Mike O'Brien.
Thank you everyone. It's wonderful to be back, and it's wonderful to see so many of you here today. Thank you for showing up, and I have an interesting presentation to give you today. I want to thank Chris for inviting me back. That was quite an evening back in February 2013 when the book was released 10 years ago on about the 50th anniversary of the Jackson Woolworth sit-in. Thanks to that invitation and to the accompanying film, An Ordinary Hero, about the life of Joan Trumpauer Mulholland, it kind of took off after that. So we are delighted that we've had the opportunity in the last 10 years to go around the country talking about the events of Jackson in 1963. I want to not only thank Chris, but, and I know she may not be in the room, but thank Pamela Jr., there she is in the back, for all of her work here in the state of Mississippi and all that you've done for history and the civil rights history. I remember before this museum was even built, Pam had put together a diorama, basically, of the Jackson sit-in in the old Smith Robertson Museum, and I believe it's still there, and it's an amazing presentation that all of you should see at some point. It makes you feel like you're right in the middle of the action. So thank you, Pam, and thank you for all your work. I'm sure you're going to have a wonderful, well-deserved retirement. And I just want to take the opportunity, too, having been here in Mississippi, my wife, who never accompanies me, she's never been to Jackson. I've been here at least 15, maybe 20 times. But every single time I go to the Archives and History to do some research, and I'll be doing it tomorrow as well. And I just want to thank all of the wonderful librarians and folks who help us out, those of us who research. They do a wonderful job. You've got an incredible collection there, and it has certainly added to what I was able to find about what happened in Jackson during those hard days of May and June of 1963. What I thought I would do just to start off is to give you a little bit of background about how I even got into this story. Why was it somebody from Northern Virginia or from the North, really, who came to tell the story of the Jackson movement, or at least this activist part of it? And it's really because of this woman right here, Joan Trumpauer Mulholland. You see her in her living room. This was just last week. I see her regularly. But 30 or so years ago, I began talking to her about her civil rights career, which she never at that time talked about. She at the time was a suburban mom raising 5 little boys. I met her through them in 1977, the year of Star Wars. You can see a couple of them have Star Wars shirts on. This was their first day of school. It was the summer before this picture was taken that I was a camp counselor at the local school for this, the day camp program. And these 5 boys came running up one day. I'd never seen them before. And since I had never seen them, I knew all the other kids. I lined them up and said, "Tell me your names from the oldest to the youngest." And here's what they told me: Bino, Django, Jomo, Loki, and Geronimo. Okay? That was what they told me. And at first I did not believe them, and I made them repeat it. And when they said it again, I thought to myself, what have your parents done to you? You know? And but I came to meet Joan through them and realized, and it kind of explained it a little bit, because she was, at the time, she drove a purple VW bus with a big peace sign on the back. So I thought of her as like the local hippie lady, you know. But as I learned, you know, activists do not like that label because the hippies kind of tuned out and turned on, whereas the activists really got involved in stuff and got things done. So in any event, it was through them that I met Joan. And I want to tell you quickly the story of how I was drawn into this story. It was through the picture. The kids would always say, "My mom's in a famous picture." And they'd say it just like that, picture. And as I became friends with the family and they invited me in, they pulled out the scrapbook and showed me this picture. And it made sense because of what I just told you about Joan. I thought, oh, this is interesting. She has a little background. I didn't know this picture. I'd never seen it before. They showed it to me. It was not the iconic photograph that it has now become. But in any event, I saw this picture and it made an impact, but it had the most impact about 15 years later. When I went on a work assignment to Atlanta, I decided to go to the Martin Luther King Center for Nonviolent Social Change and wanted to see the whole thing on my lunch hour. So I rushed through all the exhibits, and as I was on my way out the door, I saw this sign that said pictures. In this case, it did say pictures. And I thought, I got to get back to work, but I just want to sweep in there and make a quick tour of the whatever pictures they have of Dr. King and make my way back to work. Well, that quick little sweep changed my life, because in that small room with a lot of pictures of Dr. King and his movement history was this picture. And it was a shock to me to have seen it in Joan Trumpauer's living room and now be seeing it at the holiest shrine of the civil rights movement at the time. And I couldn't imagine why was this picture, along with all the other pictures of Dr. King and his glorious, movement involvement, and King is not even in this picture. Why is this picture here? And I looked at the picture and I said, I know the woman at the center of this photograph, and I don't know the story of why this is so important. And I committed myself when I got back home, I was going to sit Joan down in her living room and make her tell me the story of this picture and why it's so important, which is what I did, starting in September or October of 1991. She agreed to that. By that time, we were good friends. I brought my little tape recorder. She started telling me her story. And then as she told me her story, I began to realize that this little picture was a much bigger story than just about Joan Trumpauer. What I didn't know is that it also included the story of this man here and the story of the Mississippi movement. But Medgar Evers, of course, is inextricably tied to that picture. Some people call him the 10th demonstrator. There were 9 demonstrators that day at the counter. They call him the 10th because he really wanted to be there and he had really helped set it all up. So I didn't realize the connection between them until I started digging into it. I felt when I saw that picture in the King Museum called, really, to try to tell this story as best I could. And that's what I did with We Shall Not Be Moved. So let's get into it. I'd like to put this up here first off with Frederick Douglass. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has. It never will. What was the struggle in Jackson? Well, many of you lived it. You know, I'm trying to bring my A game here because I know all of you lived through these events. Many of you did. I'm going to skip over a couple things and jump to Capitol Street, of course, right out our doors here. Usually when I take this on the road, I have to explain about Capitol Street and how it was a wonderful place. It was like the Mall of America for Mississippi. Every single shop, restaurant, movie theater, everything you could think of for entertainment and what your needs were on Capitol Street. If you were white, it was a wonderful place to shop. If you were black, every single place you went, as you know, you were disrespected, pushed to the back of the line, not welcome. And so, as a result, it was a perfect target when black people wanted to start making some noise about how they were treated. It was a perfect target to start. So that's where the boycott started, was on Capitol Street. We'll back up a couple slides here. Many of you probably know the story of Colia Liddell, who was native Mississippian and Jacksonian. She lived in the Verdon Addition section of North Jackson, and she helped form the North Jackson Youth Council of the NAACP. And every youth council of the NAACP, as some of you may know, requires an adult advisor. And at that time, Coley was going to Tougaloo College, and in walks John Salter, incoming social science professor at Tougaloo, working along with the infamous Dr. Ernst Berinsky. And he was a firebrand. He told all the stories about the union movements and various other resistance movements throughout the world. And Coley just thought he would be the perfect person to be the advisor for the youth council that she was setting up. And so that came to be for the very first year from 1961 to 62. Salter did an awful lot of training of the kids, training them about how movements are built and how they develop. So that when in 1960, late 62, early 63, they began to take on the power structure of Mississippi, those kids were ready. So in December of 1962 was the first demonstration. It was a boycott. A boycott was not that difficult. You just had to stay away, right? You just had to stay away and not shop there. So the first demonstration they did, it was just signs advertising the fact that we're having a boycott. Please, black people, stay away from Capitol Street from here on out. We're not going to shop here anymore. It was a hard sell because people liked what they could buy on Capitol Street. So they had 2 demonstrations in December. The second one, right before Christmas, the very night of that demonstration, shots were fired into Salter's home. That's his wife right there, Eldry, and they had a little daughter. Apparently, the shot that came through the house went right over her crib where she was lying, sleeping, and lodged into the wall behind her. So that was an interesting kind of welcome to John Salter and his activist spirit. He continued with the boycott with the Youth Council and the Tougaloo students. And in April, right before Easter, once again they had pickets, again reminding people not to shop there. This is where it starts to get interesting because the national office of the NAACP is beginning to get interested in Jackson, seeing what Salter is developing. Birmingham is beginning to happen at this point. The movement in Birmingham, where Dr. King is very involved, You know the water hoses and the dogs set on children, the Children's March. That's all starting to happen, and it's pushing all the interest of people towards King and the SCLC. Roy Wilkins, the head of the NAACP in New York, is saying, well, we need a movement to get that kind of attention. And Jackson now, at this point, is ready-made for that type of movement. So the national NAACP, which Salter has been trying to get some attention from, and Medgar has too, all of a sudden gets a green light from them. And on May 12th, 1963, these are the minutes from the NAACP statewide meeting, Mississippi meeting. You don't have to read it all. The reason I'm bringing it to your attention is that this is the statement made by the state board of directors of the NAACP saying that we are going to press for changes here in Jackson, and the people who are going to be authorized to speak for us are Pearlina Lewis, who we will get to in a minute, John Salter, Medgar Evers, of course, and Mrs. Doris Allison, who was the head of the Jackson branch of the NAACP. Now, some of these names may not be that familiar to you, but they will be towards the end here. From that point, it also specifically told them they were going to send a copy of this resolution to the mayor and to the other authorities in the city of Jackson. So everybody is being put on notice that unless you start negotiating on us on some key issues of how we're treated, not just on Capitol Street, but in general, we're going to start making some noise. There's the mayor, Mayor Alan Thompson, affable, good-looking, friendly, generally, guy who was the mayor of Jackson for 20 years, right, from 1948 to 1968. He was here for the entire civil rights uprising, not only in 1963, but in the years following, and a couple of years before with the Tougaloo Nine, which my next book is going to be about. But I wanted to show you here the demands of the Jackson movement as they came to be known. They wanted desegregation of all public facilities. That's parks, libraries, the zoo, which was a big issue at the time. Remove all the segregation signs in all the areas of downtown. Desegregate the public schools. They did put in eventually, because they knew it couldn't happen overnight, desegregate the lunch counters, of course. And then the employment piece was very important. Hire some black police officers, some black crossing guards, upgrade the salaries of the black municipal workers, and most importantly, as was just negotiated in Birmingham, form a biracial committee so that we can continue to talk about these issues, because it's not going to, this is not the end, this is just the beginning. Well, of course, the mayor says, no, I'm not going to do any of that. And if it all came down to a negotiating session with the mayor and about 14 black ministers and businessmen. They met in the mayor's office. Nothing was accomplished, and it was known that if the mayor agreed to nothing after that, immediately the demonstrations would start. So one thing you do need to know before we get to that next slide is that a lot of interesting things happened just the week or so before. The mayor went on TV the very night he got that letter from the NAACP and denounced the NAACP and said, we're not going to have any of this around here. We're not going to have another Birmingham. Because he did that and named the NAACP directly, the national NAACP sued and got an FCC order, Federal Communications Order, to allow the NAACP to respond. And so the next week on the 20th of May, Medgar Evers goes on local TV and gives his reasons why this boycott and this protest of Jackson City practices is appropriate. It's the first time anything like that has happened in the city of Jackson. On the very same day, The United States Supreme Court rules that the original sit-ins, which started happening, as you know, February of 1960, they are legal. They are a legal expression of free speech, and that the police cannot disrupt them unless the store owner closes down the store and invites the police in. I mean, all these things happen almost all at the same time, and they all play into why the sit-in became the crazy situation that it did. The demonstration starts the very next day, and these three Tougaloo students are the brave souls who decide to enter the store and sit down at the whites-only counter. And I'm going to introduce them to you one at a time. We've got Perlina Lewis, who with Colia Liddell helped to start the North Jackson Youth Council. And eventually, in fact, even at this point, she was the co-chair of what was called the Boycott Committee at the time, along with Salter. So she is an obvious choice to go in because she's the leader and the youth look up to her. In fact, she was so popular, and this gets into why the youth movement kind of sprouted. Perlina had gone to both Brinkley and Lanier. I guess it was Brinkley that at first was only maybe a grade school and a middle school, and then she went from the middle school at Brinkley, where she was named Miss Brinkley, the most popular girl in the school. She went to Lanier for a year or two until the Brinkley High School was being built, and then comes back to Brinkley for another 2 years, and is in her senior year again becomes Miss Brinkley. So she is well known not only to the Brinkley kids but also to the Lanier kids. And then this is a couple years later, when she's a junior at Tougaloo, is when she enters the store. But keep that in mind as we get to the activist phase here. Most of you know Annie Moody, the author of Coming of Age in Mississippi, where she writes about her involvement in the movement in the last part of her book. And then Memphis Norman. Again, all three of them are Mississippians. Memphis was born in Alabama, but as a young person, I guess it was around 13 or 14, his family moves to Pascagoula so his dad can get one of those good shipbuilding jobs. Ends up, that doesn't go well. Father doesn't keep the job. He ends up as one of the poorest people in Mississippi, very smart. Instead of working with the rest of the family to earn a living, they keep him in school, gets a scholarship to Tougaloo, and decides that this is his moment. He gets invited in. Medgar had invited Perlina. Salter had invited Ann Moody because she was one of his best workers on the boycott. And Ann invites Memphis Norman because she knows him. One thing about Memphis that you should know is that he is Dr. Berinsky's right-hand man. Berinsky, who is the legendary social science teacher, created a lot of stir in the 50s and the 60s. Memphis Norman is his assistant, typing up his letters, working with his correspondence, putting out the newspapers, keeping the social science lab going. That's his work-study program for the 2 years, and that's who he's working for at this point. So the three of them end up at the counter. And you see them here. I love this picture because, remember the days of Woolworths with the 70-cent roast turkey dinners, I mean, amazing, right? No wonder people went there for lunch. I want to bring in Ed King here now. Many of you know Ed. He's a longtime resident, native of Vicksburg, a long-term resident of Jackson. He wanted to be here today. He is recovering from a fall in a local nursing home. I saw him last night. He gives you all his regards. And Ed King was a pivotal figure here along with Salter. He had become the Tougaloo chaplain just a few months earlier in January of 1963. Things didn't work out with the previous chaplain. Both Berinsky and Medgar Evers invited him, said, we think you could make a difference here if you apply for that job. And so he does. He gets it. He and his wife come back to Mississippi. He didn't think he'd ever be able to work here. But he took that job and quickly gets involved with Salter in the movement. In this particular situation, he's working as the spotter. He is the spotter for the demonstration, and so he is watching what happens and is calling back to the office where Medgar and Salter are that day. We've only got 3 people in the store, right? But that's what that's his role. He's not supposed to get involved. He's just supposed to be a quiet observer and calling back and letting people know what's happening. Because if they get arrested, Medgar's got to try to get the bond money together, and they need to let the media know what's going on. So that was his job. Well, when they first walk in the store, nothing really happens, which is kind of shocking. Immediate arrest was expected, right? They were going to be arrested and carted off to jail. That's the way they treated the Freedom Riders. That's the way they treated the protesters on the street. In fact, there was another protest up the street outside, and those people were arrested immediately. But these folks, after they sat down about 11:15 in the morning, nothing happens. Nobody waits on them. I mean, the waitresses, kind of freaked out and walked back to the food preparation area. At the suggestion of the manager, they turn off the lights and they close that area, but they're allowed to just sit there. And as you can see, the press really were there. Medgar had alerted the press that something was going to be happening on Capitol Street. He didn't tell them exactly what, because they wanted the element of surprise. But and the reason for that is they didn't want an immediate arrest. They wanted the media to get there and take some pictures before the police came in. But because of the Supreme Court ruling just that week, the police said, okay, we can't go in. We're going to stay outside and see what happens. So nothing much happens until the lunch hour. And at that point, a former police officer, Benny Oliver, comes in, sees what's happening, doesn't like it, pulls Memphis Norman off the stool, starts kicking him mercilessly. Medgar curls up, Memphis curls up into a ball, trying to keep the blows away. As it turns out, you can see where he's kicking. Right there, he's kicking like his shoulder, but he got him in the face, he got him in the head, he got him all over the place. There was no restraint because there was no one there to stop this wild man. And you can see the pictures behind Oliver. Nobody's trying to stop him. Everybody kind of expected this kind of violence to break out. And I got to say something about the police chief, Ray, John Ray, who knew this was going to happen. And it was the lawyers who advised the police to stay out of the store. And Ray said, if you do that, it's going to be mayhem. But his higher-ups said, no, we're going to do what the lawyers say. So Ray quickly said, well, you know what, I'm going to send in an undercover cop because I know something bad is going to happen. And so while this is going on, that undercover cop, does anybody remember the name of Jim Black? Jim Black at one point became the police chief eventually, and there were some difficult circumstances that he left under, but at this time he's an undercover detective in the store, and he comes up and stops it, stops Benny Oliver from kicking Norman, grabs them both, arrests them both, and takes them out of the store. Oliver, of course, for assault, Norman for breach of the peace. Like if he hadn't been there, then Oliver wouldn't have done what he did. It's his fault for stirring people up, and getting them upset. So anyway, they were both carted off to jail in separate police cars, of course, segregated. But in the meantime, Oliver has also pulled Annie Moody off of her stool, thrown her against the other display counters, and pulled Perlina off of her stool. And Perlina is down on the ground, kind of clutching onto the bottom of the stool, the base of the stool, when Jim Black comes in and grabs the two of them and gets them out. So Perlina quickly gets back on her stool, and Annie comes back and sits with her. So the demonstration can continue, right? At that point, so now Joan comes involved, right? This little white Tougaloo student, who the first white student to integrate Tougaloo as a full-time student, and Lois Chafee, a first-year English assistant kind of doing remedial English with some of the students who needed that at Tougaloo. They were spotting the demonstration that was up the street, and they had called back to Medgar, said they all got arrested quickly. You know, what should we do? And then they said, well, nothing much seems to be happening. We haven't seen anybody pulled out of Woolworth yet, so let's go down there and see what's going on. Well, of course, what they see when they get there is this kind of stuff, and they're freaked out by it. And they go up to Ed King and said, well, what are we going to do? Those two women now are sitting there by themselves. Well, Joan was the first one to act. She said, I'm going to go sit down with them. She had a long history of already being in civil rights demonstrations in North Carolina, in Northern Virginia, in Rock Hill, South Carolina. She was experienced. She said, I know what has to happen. I'm going to go sit with them. So she did. She's the first white person to join the demonstration, and at that, the crowd kind of goes wild. And they can't believe that a white person would sit down with black people here in Jackson. Lois, well, what immediately happens is both Joan and Anne get pulled off their stool and dragged out of the store. And what we see outside is a white guy pushing a white Southern girl out the door. And the police arrest the guy and let Joan go. Like, okay, they weren't in the store to see that Joan was sitting in, but they didn't know why. Anyway, he gets arrested, and she gets to go back in the store. Ann Moody has also been pulled off her stool, has somewhere lost her shoes in the fracas. She gets pulled by her hair, but never got pulled all the way out. So they both try to get back to Perlina, but they can't quite get there because the crowd is now like buzzing around. So they just get to wherever they can at the counter because they feel like they're going to be safer there than standing in the crowd. Meanwhile, Lois has seen all this and says, well, Perlina's there by herself. I better jump in. And she sits down next to Perlina. So now we have 4 women in 2 separate groups holding down the fort on the counter. The kids see what happened to the guy who pulled them out, and they don't want that to happen. They don't want to get arrested, so they start having a food fight. And that turns into a big fuss. Well, Ed King has now been communicating with Medgar and Salter back at the office. And what Ed told me last night, the first time I've heard him say this, he said Medgar was extremely concerned about the safety of the students, particularly Perlina, whom he knew personally, and wanted to go down there himself to try to help out. Salter told him not to. He said, you can't, you're a marked man. If you go down there, it's going to make it worse. And what Ed said, he told Medgar, look, we're each doing our own specific role. Your role right now is to call the media, call the Justice Department, get some help. But you going down there is not going to help. Salter decided to go down. And so he joins the fracas, as does Walter Williams. Now, this name may be familiar to you because Walter Williams was the president in 1961 of the student body at Jackson State. He got expelled for his role with the Tougaloo Nine, supporting the Tougaloo Nine. But he's still in Jackson, still trying to help out, happens to come across Salter as he's getting in his car, says, I'll go with you. So the two of them join the 2 different groups. Salter happens to get with Joan and Anne, and Williams goes with Lois and Perlina. So this is that famous photograph that you see. And we will have a brief opportunity to talk about the photographer. But what we see here is exactly what was going on. We have a big group of young white kids, mostly Central High seniors, who have been let out early. This is the last week of school, and they are just enjoying themselves to no end by dumping food and making a big laugh about what's going on with the people at the counter. When Salter joined, and you can see that the guy with the cigarette in his mouth, his name is D.C. Sullivan. I had a chance to talk with him, and his story is also part of the book, because I wanted to try to tell a holistic picture of what was going on here. So I not only talked to the people, all the demonstrators that I could talk with, but I also talked with people I could find in the crowd. I talked to reporters who were there. I even talked to, as I mentioned, police officer Jim Black, who was there. So I tried to get a kind of a sense of the whole picture of what was going on. And what D.C. Sullivan told me is that he had never, not just never seen, but never expected to see in the city of Jackson a white person sitting with a black person in a public place like this, sitting down to have a cup of coffee. And he was not as upset at the black people, because he knew, he had heard about demonstrations going on in other cities. He knew this was eventually going to get to Jackson, but what he was most upset about was the white people sitting down with the black people. And he called, he had the typical lingo at the time that they were degrading themselves by doing that. So you can see, he looks like he's looking at the camera, but he's not. He's looking at Salter, and he's really angry that this white man would sit down with Ann Moody. And what happens to Salter is unconscionable, because even though it looks like they're all having fun dumping salt and sugar and stuff, eventually, and he wouldn't admit to it, but he's the only one with the cigarette in his hand, D.C. Sullivan puts his cigarette out on the back of Salter's neck. One of the kids breaks one of those sugar canisters, it might be that one, on the counter and starts rubbing the glass against the back of his neck. These are torture techniques. This is terrorist kind of activity to try to get him, to leave. Somebody comes up to him almost as soon as he sits down with a pair of brass knuckles and hits him on the side of the head. Same thing happened to Memphis Norman. Salter almost falls off his chair, but hangs on. And so this kind of activity went on for 3 hours, from the time they entered the store at 11:15 to the time it ends at 2:15. These people are harassed horribly. Joan talks about an out-of-body experience that she has, in a way that, it was so intense that she couldn't even keep her consciousness. It was like she was floating above the scene. It was a horrible, horrible scene, and the photographer who stayed and took these pictures, Fred Blackwell, calls it a terrible day for Mississippi, a horrible day for the city. This is what's going on the other side. Walter Williams has been knocked off his stool by somebody throwing an ashtray. They were pulling stuff off the counters and just starting to throw it. They had spray paint. They spray painted all of them. There's Perlina at the counter, and you can just see the bare shadow almost of Lois Chafee behind her, talking with a reporter. They're actually conducting an interview in the midst of all this. George Raymond, who was a Corps worker getting ready to make his mark in Canton over the next couple of years, was staying with Corps leader Dave Dennis here in Jackson just while the Canton project was getting started. He walks in and, of course, also gets assaulted, as does Tom Beard, Jim Hill Sr., and Dr. Beidel. We'll talk about him in a minute, but there's Tom, right? He goes and sits next to Ann Moody. I don't think he gets you don't see him too roughed up. But he came down, he was working up the street at another Five and Dime, heard about Memphis Norman getting kicked off the stool and decides to take Memphis's place. Dr. Beidel at the very end there has a key role in bringing this to a resolution. He was the president of Tougaloo College. He may be the only president of a college in America during the 1960s who went down and tried to help the demonstrators, the student demonstrators, rather than trying to stop it. There he's talking with another reporter, Ken Toller from the Memphis Commercial Appeal. But what he did is he saw it on TV. He came down to try to help stop it. He goes to the police and says, can't you all go in there and stop what's going on? Oh, Supreme Court says we can't do that. Why don't you go in and see if you can get those demonstrators out of there? Then he goes to try to talk to the manager and says, look, they're also telling me that they can't come in unless you close this door. Would you please close this door? I'm not supposed to do that. I'm just a little peon here. You'll have to talk to the Woolworth in New York. So he calls New York, and they finally get in touch with the manager and say, they're destroying your store. Would you just please close the store? So that's what he does. And in this situation, you can see the crowd has dispersed and things are closing down. Ed King has come to the assistance now of the demonstrators. John Salter, he tries to clean up John Salter and says, "Don't you touch me. I want the cameras to see exactly what they did to me." So that's how it comes to a close. After 3 hours, and Freddie Blackwell's last picture of the day is this one as they're waiting for the cars to come up and take them to safety. And Captain Ray, finally, while they're outside the store, is protecting them from others who would still like to hurt them that are standing outside of the frame of the picture. But you can see them, Dr. Beidel, Ann Moody, George Raymond, Perlina there in the center, John Salter, Tom Beard towards the right, and then Joan's dress is right down here. She's right behind Captain Ray. So most of the people, Walter Williams, I'm not sure what happened to him. He might be out of the frame as well, but they're all right there waiting. And that's the crazy story of the Jackson Woolworth sit-in. I'll quickly slip through some of these pictures. I wanted to mention Doris Allison. She was a key figure, and this is she the next day. Demonstrations continue for the next 2 weeks, solid, every single day on Capitol Street. There's a whole bigger story about how the National NAACP gets involved and tries to kind of calm it down a little bit, and then there's a big tension within the agitation side that they don't, who's going to be in charge? Is the National NAACP or is it going to be the local people? And that's a much bigger story that we don't have time for. But Doris Allison was a big part of this. The young people start getting riled up. This was the very next day. They start making signs that says, "We shall overcome," singing freedom songs. They get arrested that Friday. 400 of them walk out of their schools at the last day of school, and they start marching from each of the high schools. Jim Hill, Lanier, Brinkley, Holy Ghost, and they start, and even Campbell College had a high school. They all start marching towards Capitol Street and get arrested. This is what it looked like at the fairgrounds. And the press went wild with that, at least the northern press did, showing that they're being that they're being kept in places where animals are typically kept for the state fair. Roy Wilkins comes down. This is his big moment, and he marches with Medgar in front of Woolworth, gets arrested, is bonded out, goes back to New York the same day. But this is what Jackson had become. You see the police dogs in the car. They learned a little something from Birmingham. They didn't let those dogs out. But everybody's got a gun. Everybody's ready to shoot. And it's kind of a madhouse here. We know that Medgar is assassinated. There's going to be a lot of attention to that in the next couple of weeks. So I won't go into that in much detail. Salter gets assaulted, even not in a demonstration, just standing on somebody's porch, but the police know that he's the guy who's leading this whole thing along with Medgar. And after Medgar's assassination, they go after him. He nearly gets killed, makes his most dramatic entry at the mass meeting that night. Again, I want the people to see what they've done to me. He got a concussion in his head by being hit over the head with a billy club. This is Medgar's funeral. The first really mass communications event of the 60s and the biggest funeral at the time. You can see all the media up front. 5,000 people are said to have been at that funeral. There was the march. It was a silent march that the mayor had required in order to have it. You can see some of the luminaries who are there, including Dr. King, Roy Wilkins next to him, Abernathy behind King, Wyatt T. Walker, John Salter's here, Ed King is here. So lots of people show up for that. But it's a horrible and tragic moment. And Dr. King, this is him on Ferris Street in front of the funeral home, realizing that this situation is going to turn really bad. And so his advisors get him out of there even before the march is finished. 5,000 people marched that day in 100-degree heat from the Masonic Temple, the 2 miles or so down to the Collins Funeral Home. And at the very end of the march, where the SNCC kids and some of the leaders of the North Jackson Youth Council were, somebody breaks the silence. Somebody says, and we're not exactly sure who. I think Dr. Chamberlain has identified the person as a young girl from the Jackson movement, singing "Oh Freedom." You just start singing a very sad version of "Oh Freedom," and then Dory Ladner, one of the Ladner sisters, picks up on that and starts singing "This Little Light of Mine." And then the silence is broken. The kids start marching towards Capitol Street, and everybody starts to follow them. The police back up to try to protect Capitol Street, and this is what happens. There's a deadly standoff that could have turned really horrible. John Doerr of the Justice Department steps in the breach, tells everybody, look, this is not what Medgar would want. Please calm down, and let's put this thing to bed right now. So there is not a shootout, but there certainly could have been. The Kennedys get involved, working with the mayor, on the phone with him daily. There are tapes of this that I was able to get, along with the FBI files from this time, that clearly show that this is what the Kennedys are focused on. There's a horrible crash where Salter and King, riding in the same car, the car on the left, you can see that was Ed King's face went through that windshield. And that's where he got the horrible scarring and the needed surgeries afterward. They almost die. Finally, the Jackson movement agrees to these concessions by the mayor, or the mayor agrees to them. He will hire 6 black police officers, 8 black crossing guards, 1 garbage truck supervisor, 7 heavy machinery operators. He will continue discussions with the black leaders, but there won't be a biracial committee. And for all that, they have to stop the demonstrations. For those, they look like such modest agreements now on the face of it. And yet, at the time, it was progress. And so that evening, the ministers hold a mass meeting with the community, and after a lot of tension and a lot of back and forth, they finally get people to say, okay, this is enough. But if you think of it, this is what we got from Medgar's life. But it was the beginning. It was the beginning of change. Perlina called it the beginning of change in Mississippi. I think I better stop there because of the time, and I want you to have the opportunity to ask a few questions. I do want to just show you the picture of Fred Blackwell from back at that time, a 22-year-old Jackson Daily News photographer. I don't think I would be up here without that photograph. I don't think we would remember this event without that photograph. So we have a lot to thank Fred for. He is still with us. He's living just north of Jackson. And I get to see him every now and again when I come here. I was hoping he'd be here now, but he's not in great health either. So, these folks who were so important to our movement are now moving on. There he is at Tougaloo College, where there is a floor-to-ceiling mural of this event. They are so proud of the Tougaloo involvement here. And why don't we just stop right there and let's get some discussion going. Thank you. Chris is going to bring the microphone around if everyone has a comment or a question.
Haired fellow, but was he the one smoking the cigarette? And
He's the one smoking the cigarette, yes.
I was told that, because he died a few years ago, but that he was unrepentant till the day he died about what he did.
Yes, that is true, and the reason I know that is because I took a copy of the book to him in 2014, and I had visited him. In fact, I have a picture of him later here. There's Miss Allison, when I was talking with her back in the 90s. There's Lillian Louie, who was Medgar's secretary. And I got a chance to talk with her at the time she was working for the Catholic Diocese. There's D.C. Sullivan, when I talked with him the night in 1996. He was unrepentant even to about a year before he died. He believed he was defending the Southern way of life, and he believed that that's what all of his friends were doing. His wife was horrified when he was talking this way and said, "Mike, we have lots of friends who are black. This is not who we are." And so I turned to DC and I said, this was, by this point he was on oxygen and having a hard time of it. I said, DC, is that how you see it? He said, I don't have any problem with black people, but I have a problem with intermarriage, the intermingling of, the races. And that, of course, is the basis of the white supremacist view, that we have to keep it all separate and keep the bloodlines pure. So to say he was unrepentant, I don't know. He never did repent of it, but he certainly kept his white supremacist views all the way through his life. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Good morning. There's two people that you showed on the program on your presenters that I'm very familiar with. That Dr. Cola Liddell, who was my classmate
Yes.
at Lanier High School. And the iron thing is that we know she was going to be all right, because in high school we had one donkey, cut him in half. One get the smarter get the front end of the donkey. The less smartest person get the back end of the donkey with a star on it. She got the front end of the donkey, and I got the back end of the donkey with the star on it. Paulina Lewis and I, we grew up together in the same neighborhood.
Is that right? Wow.
We went to the same church. Some of her church members are here, and her brother just happened to come down and be with us. The Reverend Alfonso Lewis was her brother.
Yes, Alfonso, yes. I did want to ask anybody who was in the Jackson movement to just please stand and be recognized. Anyone in this group right now? Come on, Alfonso, you got to stand up. Anybody who was in the movement? Jan Hillegas, I know, was there. Two other folks on this side. Can they introduce themselves, Chris?
Oh, I'm Henry Cheatham. Hi, good morning. Good afternoon. It's afternoon. Yeah. Good afternoon. My name is Henry Cheatham. I'll stand up again.
Sorry.
I'm not like it was when I was 19.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm Henry Cheatham, and I was at the fairground, and I think, and I'm not sure, that I was with Meg Evers for the last Sunday of his life. We had gone to the First Baptist, to the church over there. He had dropped us off. They wouldn't let us in.
You were in the kneel-ins, yeah.
Right, he wouldn't let us in the church. They had a whole bunch of state troopers, blocking the way. They were pleasant. The guy's name was Mr. Gregory. He said, we do have colored folks come to the church. He said, but today we would rather not because of the activity, right? And so we went back and we got into the car because we stopped Mega because he was going around the block. And as we was driving back, I asked him, I said, these guys know you, fire department. They looked at his car. And I think that's the last Sunday that he lived.
Yes, it was.
Yeah,
yes,
okay.
It was. Amazing. You were part of that, yeah. Over here.
I want to thank you for not only talking about the foreground, the people in the foreground, which we all often think of when we think of civil rights picture or any action picture, the people in the foreground, and we rarely look at the people in the background, lynching pictures like this, and I really appreciate, because it's always going through my mind, especially talking about truth and reconciliation in South Africa, a place like that,
Yes.
that those folks are not left off the hook, yet we let them off the hook all the time, and I want to talk about the background folks
Yes.
all the time. So thank you for doing that.
Let me tell you how that came about. I was blind to it, just as you were saying most of us are, because you're looking at where the action is and what's going on. It was Fred Blackwell, the photographer, when I first talked with him. And I end the book with his story and how he came to take this picture and his feelings about it years later. But he said, well, you know, these people are still around. You could find them. He didn't tell me where to find them, but he said you could still find them. And he identified D.C. in particular because he knew him. Fred Blackwell had grown up on the same street as D.C. Sullivan. And Fred was only 22, so he knew D.C.'s older brothers. And so I went to the education department archives and looked at Central High School's 1963 yearbook and tried to match up pictures with, you know, in the yearbook with this picture, and found, although I found a few people that I thought, and the amazing thing about Jackson, and maybe a lot of smaller cities, everybody stayed, right? They were all here. I just need to look them up in the phone book, that old yellow pages kind of thing that we used to look at, right? And they were all still around. So I was able to call them, find out, and DC was probably the only one that I found who was central to the photograph, who was willing to talk to me. And I give him a lot of credit for that. Now, DC's story doesn't end here. This may have been the worst thing he did in his life. 2 weeks after his graduation, which was a week later, he's on a bus headed to a Marine training boot camp and ends up in Vietnam and gets shot up in Vietnam. So the reason that he had oxygen at the end of his life, he still had shrapnel in his heart from an explosion that happened while he was in Vietnam. So, you know, he was an American villain and an American hero, all in the same person. It's a very complicated story. Ma'am, I saw you at Dr. Chamberlain's event a couple weeks ago, and I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. And this has been so moving for those of us that were there, and not at the caliber of your book, but I did write my book,
Yes.
Grown at 13, and it is about the 4 years of 1963, 64, 65, 66, and I was a member of the North Jackson Youth Council, and a friend of Perlina. We were members of the same church, Cade Chapel Missionary Baptist Church. And this is something I think we do need to do more, and trying to understand not only just what happened, but where do we go from here?
Yes.
Especially when we see so many rollbacks that are happening in our community especially. I just wanted to say thank you for your continued effort, and maybe we'll have a chance to sit down and talk.
Would love that. Thank you. Thank you for being here, and all that you all did, all those of you who stood up for the Jackson movement. We didn't, I kind of watched over, but Jan Hillegas, who has been here for all these years now, right behind Chris, she got arrested several times on Capitol Street with the other students who were going up and down. I think a Primos was the first one, and I think there was another one after Medgar was killed. But anyway, Jan is an important person, does a lot of research here, and does a lot of good work in Jackson. Yes, sir.
Actually, what I'm going to say actually follows up on the last statement which the young lady made previously, and that is, first of all, I want to thank you for. I wasn't around Jackson at that time, although I graduated Tougaloo in '55.
Oh.
But what concerns me is to what extent are we still dealing with the mindset of individuals like those who were in the background?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think she's alluded to that in her comment, and I think that's what we should be concerned about right now, because I see some serious backsliding.
There's a lot of lessons we can learn, right, from what happened. One more, Chris? Just
I hate that. We'll have to ask it in the book line. I'm
Okay.
sorry, y'all. I know
All
that it's that one of my favorite things about the series, of course, is that we usually have more questions than we have time for. We've sort of slipped past the top of the hour.
Right.
And so, but a reminder that we do have copies of the book for sale. If you didn't get a chance to ask your question, I'd be glad to talk to you about it over here. I hope that we see you back next week for History is Lunch. Don't forget about the other programs that we have coming up. Today, help me thank Mike O'Brien for this fabulous program.
Oh, Chris, if I could, just one announcement that I have. The actual anniversary on May 28th, Joan Trumpauer is holding an